Welcome to SHAKA Movement's Maui Malama Aina show. I'm Megan Powers, and I'm here with our guest today, Dahl, my mother, and we're here to share a PowerPoint presentation with you that we've put together for churches and senior centers, and really for everybody who might be confused about how to vote on the GMO moratorium.
We found that a lot of people are really confused about the issue. There have been a lot of mailers and TV ads going out there. So it's our intention to do our best to put a little balance in the picture and share with you what we care, why we are interested in this issue.
And also, we felt it was important to give people an education about the broader issues that are involved here and what led to the creation of the moratorium. And with both of our backgrounds, we felt like we had some mana'o to share on these issues. So thank you for joining us. And Diana, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
I've been a farmer since 1988, and I haven't done it alone, that's for sure. I had a wonderful farming partner, Roy Smith, who was instrumental in helping us become organic. In 1989, a lot of our organic farming friends attended a conference, the MOA conference on Ag in the 21st century.
That's the Mokichi Okada Association conference.
That's right. And we were all so impressed with the possibility of creating an example for the rest of Maui and the world that we formed an organization called Maui Sustainable Farm Alliance, which became a feeder group for Hawaii Organic Farmers Association,
the certifying agency in the state of Hawaii. So if you want to be a certified organic farm, you go through HOFA, the certifying agency.
Well, during that time, when HOFA was on the island of Maui, I was the administrator. That was 6 years, and so was instrumental in helping develop these certification standards. And we ended up learning a lot about inputs that were organic and not organic, inputs that were allowed, restricted, and prohibited. And so I wanted to share a little bit about that with you today. Our intention is not to go rah-rah organic, it's simply to share with you some of the history of this. Well, here's our farm, Melody Farm in Haiku, and there I am in my taro patch. And in the center of the photo collage, there are some kalo corms, and those won the Best in Show at the Maui County Fair in 1998. There's Megan on her way to market with pineapple and pumpkin, and there I am with a lot more taro.
All right, and I'll just share a little bit of why I'm here speaking about the moratorium. I grew up on Maui in an off-the-grid homestead, trying to live as sustainably and self-sufficiently as possible. Graduated from Seabury Hall, went off to University of California, Santa Cruz. I got a degree in biology there and a specialization in human health psychology. Then I did postgraduate work in genetics. I came back to Maui and worked at NIFTAL, which was a charter out of the College of Tropical Agriculture from UH, studying nitrogen-fixing tropical agricultural legumes. And I was doing research on the soil bacterium, doing genetic research, tagging things with P32 and splicing genes. So I have enough of a background in genetics to be able to talk about and understand what the risks and benefits are with genetic engineering and how it relates to farming and health. So thank you for joining us, and shall we begin?
Well, yes, I want to say fortunately Megan also spent some time in the HOFA office helping certify organic farms. And by the time HOFA was subsumed by the USDA certification in 2000, we had 450 certified farms in the state.
Excellent.
Let's go.
All right, here goes. So, why are we here? Remember, this presentation is from what we put together to present to churches and seniors and anyone else out there who would like to have a presentation. Please contact us. We'd be happy to do one for your group. All right, so the Citizens Initiative for a temporary moratorium on the cultivation of GMO crops until proven safe has required that people learn about the issues. And we're here to share our mana'o, our knowledge on farming and genetics. And also to clarify some issues about the bill. We've studied the bill in depth, and for example, the testing required by the moratorium is 100% funded by industry, not the county, as the other people would like you to believe. So we can go over that in more detail later. So who started this and why? Well, here we are on SHAKA Movement's Maui Malama Aina show, and Sustainable Hawaiian Agriculture for the Keiki and the Aina, that's what SHAKA means. It was a think tank assembled to address the issue of food security and sustainability for Maui Nui long into the future. And when we looked at all the issues involved here, of what it would take, we realized that one of the biggest threats to the Aina's ability to sustain future generations were the current GMO activities going on here. And then also with further investigation led to the discovery of higher rates of birth defects near GMO fields, especially on Kauai, but starting to show up here, and we want to take action before it gets too bad. And so anyway, that's why the bill was born. About the bill.
Well, it's a true democratic process by the people and for the people. This is the first ever citizens initiative to go for a vote.
That's right. But it may be the last, because the state, with pressure from industry, has been trying to preempt the county's ability to make rights and laws that are more protective. They say that they have all the regulators and all the regulations in place at the state level, but they're not doing their job. On Kauai, the state is not regulating pesticide exposure to children enough. And so that's why Kauai had to stand up. And so they're trying to prevent, industry is trying to prevent us from being able to make laws. Everybody needs to get really active this next legislative session at the state level to protect our rights.
And this will not affect backyard gardeners or small farmers or school children. It only is targeted to those who knowingly replant GMO seeds after the bill is in place. So you have to have a contract to buy GMO seed. You can't pick them up at the market or at Ace Hardware or anywhere else on the island. They're distributed by big seed distributors, and the contracts are for large amounts of seeds at once.
And so just so you know, Peter Carlisle in the TV ads always leaves out the word knowingly. He leaves it out. And then that justifies his argument about little kids and your wife watering the plant are accessories to a crime, which is just absolutely ridiculous and not true.
So Rodale Institute back east has just completed in 2011 a 30-year farming systems trial. Wonderful. An opportunity to compare conventional and organic systems and see which ones were most beneficial ecologically and financially. But basically, I mentioned organic and conventional. There are three general types of farming here on Maui. There's the conventional farming. It's a system that relies on synthetic nitrogen for fertility and synthetic herbicides for weed control, both made from fossil fuels. Monocropping is standard practice. Then there's organic, and a system of farming that does not use synthetic chemicals, but instead mimics natural systems, and GMO, which uses the same methods as conventional farming, except that it starts with a genetically engineered seed, which confers special traits to a plant, like resistance to Roundup or 2,4-D.
However, GMO research is not farming, and that's the majority of what's going on here in our Maui fields.
So these farming trials back east 30 years, they compared conventional to organic row crop trials. And in 2008, since the Department of Agriculture had done a survey and discovered that 93% of soybeans growing in the U.S. were GMO, and 74% of corn growing in the U.S. were GMO, Rodale decided to substitute or replace conventional seed with GMO seed. So the last 3 years of the trial were specific to genetically modified organisms.
So even though here on the tables it says organic versus conventional, really what's going on is that it's organic versus GMO. because they replaced the conventional seed with GMO seed, and this only covers that last 3 years. In our profit-driven world, what's going to help sustainable agriculture get a stronger foothold? We now, from the results of these trials at Rodale Institute, very respectable institution, we see that in actuality, organic wins out in every category with regard to yields, profit, income, and returns, and also drought tolerance. Organic gives you higher yields and higher profit and higher income and returns and better drought tolerance compared to conventional, which brought less yield, less profit, higher expensive. And then it also, conventional GMO farming required more energy input and led to more greenhouse gas production, both because of all the shipping of the fossil fuels, of the products, of the fertilizer and the pesticides, that they themselves are fossil fuel based. When in an organic system, you're creating your fertilizer right there on site. You're making compost piles. You might bring in a few amendments, but you're working with what you have in nature and what's already established well there.
GMOs and pesticides. This is the connection that we want to make today. And we need to follow the money. The corporations making GMOs are also the world's largest chemical companies. The top 6 GMO companies also control about 70% of the global pesticide market.
Whoa.
And this graph here demonstrates that. Back in 1996, you see the seed sales were started, and all the way up to 2012, there's something like $14.8 billion a year in seed sales.
In GMO seed sales.
Yeah.
And the thing is that pesticide sales are totally tied to GMO seed sales. And that's why in this GMO moratorium, they're inextricably linked. You can't remove one from the other, because when you purchase GMO seed, you must also buy the corresponding herbicide to which that seed has been developed to be resistant to which that seed is resistant.
And that's a part of the contract that you sign. And you can't replant the seed. I think we take this up later, but you cannot replant the seed from that year. You need to buy new seed every year.
So seed sales are tied to pesticide sales, and that means big money for the companies. I'm going to give you some background about genetics, and I'll try to make this simple and fast. DNA, and we see here this is spiral DNA, and if you zoom in close, you can see that there's A, T, G, C, C, and that's the code. DNA is a code, whether it's a bacteria or a human or a goat or a blade of grass, we all share DNA. DNA codes for proteins, and proteins are these long strings of amino acids, and then together those create the organism. There's 2 types of proteins. There's functional proteins and structural proteins. The body of the person or the plant, that's the structural protein. All the cellular operations that are taking place all the time, 100,000 reactions a second in your cells, those are handled by enzymes, which are also proteins coded for by DNA. And so those are the functional proteins. The thing is that genetic engineering is not precise, and so when you change the code, you can change the protein, which then leads to a change in structure and function. So what is a GMO? Well, GMOs are created when a scientist in a laboratory inserts a gene from one or multiple organisms into the DNA of another organism. And this process is called genetic engineering. What's going on is that we're creating new life forms. Genetic engineering of crops involves inserting bacteria and viral genes into the DNA of a plant, even antibiotic resistance. What happens is the resulting genetically modified organism, or GMO, it may look like a plant, but it is a new life form. It's never before been seen on Earth, and it would never occur on its own in nature. Now, I'd just like to remind you, you know when you're on the airplane and you're coming here to Maui and everybody has to fill out that form about whether or not you're bringing fruits and vegetables and funguses and viruses and whatnot to the state of Hawaii, and you have to disclose everything you might be bringing and give it to the USDA ag people so that you don't harm our fragile ecosystem that has the highest number of endangered species in the world, the state of Hawaii. It's a $250,000 fine if you have a snake. And here, they're inventing and creating organisms on a regular basis, right here in Maui County. They are making new organisms that are combinations of viruses and bacteria and plants. It's like, whoa.
I wanted to have another parenthetical concept here. You've all heard of hybridization. That's how plants have been created to become more tasty and more healthy. Thousands of years, hybridization has been going on. We are hybridized as humans. Megan is a combination of her father and me.
And I'll just speak to that. You know, my dad has curly hair, my mom has blue eyes. And luckily, those genes that landed right next to each other. My dad didn't stick his curly hair right into the middle of my blue eye genes, and I don't have curly eyes and blue hair.
Yeah, right. I've noticed that. So here we are. That very possibly can happen with genetic engineering, because at the macro level, it is precise, but not at the micro level. They don't know where those genes are going, and Megan will talk about that in more detail in a minute. Anyway, there are two types of GMO plants. There's the herbicide resistant, and the herbicide can be applied to the crop, and the weeds around it die, but not the crop. The crop absorbs the herbicide. And then there's the insecticide producing. The genes from the bacteria Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT, are inserted into the crop DNA so that the plant produces the BT toxin, killing insects. Okay.
And it turns out that 80% of the world's BT corn seed is grown here. That's direct from the Monsanto website. So we know that they're doing production here, but we also know that the majority of their work is research.
And it's shipped everywhere. Those corn seeds go everywhere. I think there's maybe one or two farms in Kula who are large enough to buy corn seed here. But that's about it.
How is a GMO made? You borrow this circular ring of DNA called a plasmid, and you take that from E. coli. And then in order to make the BT corn, you take the BT toxin gene out of a soil bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis, and you insert that into your circle of DNA. So you insert your little BT toxin gene. And then if you also want to make the plant Roundup resistant, there's another soil bacterium that's developed resistance to Roundup, and you take that gene also and you stick that into this little plasmid ring. And then you might also add antibiotic resistance, even to 3 different types of antibiotic, so that you can filter out your cells that received your gene construct from the ones that didn't. Then they use what's called a gene gun. These circular pieces of DNA get attached to microscopic balls of gold, and those get shot at high speed into the cells of the plant. Then the DNA comes off of those little balls and goes into the nucleus of the plant and fuses and becomes a part of their DNA. They take that and they grow up their plants that have the gene construct inserted into them, and then they take those seeds and they multiply those seeds here. They're doing both the research here and the seed production here. So why should we be concerned? If you look closely here, this is an example of DNA. This is a chromosome with millions and millions of base pairs in the DNA. And so when they take their little circular ring it can insert in 1,000 places through there. And the corn genome has 20 chromosomes, like we have 46 chromosomes. So the corn plant has 20. And so you can get in one cell thousands and thousands of copies of, say, the Bt toxin that is producing Bt toxin to kill insects. But we eat that.
Did you want to talk about that? About how much Bt is in one corn plant?
Yes. If you took one ear of corn from the Bt corn and you ate that ear of corn, you would get so much Bt toxin. In order to get that equivalent amount from the soil, like where the Bt toxin originates from, you'd have to eat soil 24 hours a day for 3 weeks. 24 hours a day for 3 weeks in order to equal the amount of Bt that you're getting in one ear of corn. That's your corn chips, that's your tortillas, that's the corn that's in your cornbread. Whoa.
We didn't talk about the papaya. I think we should mention that that's a little different here, and this is one big concern that people have been having. You want to?
Okay. Yeah, papaya is a little different. It wasn't designed with herbicide resistance so that the company could sell herbicide, and it wasn't designed with the Bt gene. What they're trying to do is fight against the ring spot virus, and so they actually inoculated the papaya by taking some of the ring spot virus and inserting it into the DNA of the papaya. So when it was exposed in nature to ring spot virus, it was already in a way inoculated, or what's it called when you
Well, made resistant, yeah.
yeah, when you get a
Vaccinated.
shot. Vaccinated, that's the term. Thank you, Mom. So the plant was already vaccinated against that virus. The thing is that it's only against that one form of ring spot virus, and there's a lot of other forms, and so it's not resistant to those other forms. And the other thing is that there have never, ever been any feeding studies done, animal or human, on the rainbow papaya.
We don't know what effect it might have. Well, so Hawaii is a laboratory for GMOs. This is something that we really have to understand. We are here as a laboratory. Just this year, 1,100 special experimental permits to grow GMO crops were issued in Hawaii, compared to 100 special permits for California. These islands are ground zero for the largest GMO crop and chemical open field experimental tests in the world, and they've never done an environmental impact statement.
If you're going to install a golf course, or if you're going to build a hotel, you have to do an environmental impact statement. Here we are in the pristine paradise, most remote land in the world, and they're messing with the environment and the people and the genetic integrity of these islands, and they've never done an EIS? Whoa.
That's what this is about.
The other thing that's of grave concern is that these are open field tests, and what that does is that puts us in the petri plate. And so those kids on the side of the road with their sign saying, "I don't want to be a part of your chemical experiments," that's actually accurate information. We're not overreacting. See, what's going on here is that there's research and development of seed traits and herbicide resistance. It's conducted here in open air fields. They use 80 chemicals in combinations to test for their effectiveness as pesticides while they analyze GMO trait stability. So it's really the next generation of pesticide is being developed here. And how do they do that? Well, they're like, okay, what happens if we add this and this? Can the plant survive? They're inserting genes, and they're coming up with new versions of plants and trying to develop resistance to new chemical cocktails. All that experimentation is happening here. And the other thing is that we have 3 to 4 growing seasons compared to, say, Iowa, where even if you're a GM corn farmer in Iowa, you might apply your Roundup 3 times in a season, in the beginning, in the middle, and at the end right before harvest, to ripen the product and also to make sure you're not harvesting weeds. But here, They apply pesticides up to 300 days a year. We have so much more pesticide exposure than any other place in the world.
And just to comment on that, this is not conventional farming. This is research. Conventional farmers apply pesticides maybe 6 to 10 times during a cropping cycle. Maybe they use 8 to 12 different kinds of pesticides. The GMO farmer, I say that in quotes, researcher, is applying maybe every hour a combination, a chemical cocktail of pesticides. As Megan said, 300 days out of the year on average. So here's an example of Monsanto contamination drift from their Mokulele and Ohukai fields, just above Kihei.
We wanted people to be aware. The yellow lines represent the trade winds, and the blue lines represent the water runoff. And so those are both sources of pesticide drift and genetic drift and contamination of our neighborhoods. Monsanto has posted on the Maui County website in their annual report that in 2013, the list is actually longer than this. It includes 15 chemicals that are restricted use that they're required to report. There's also non-restricted use pesticides that they use, which we don't know what they are. We know, of course, that it's Roundup. Roundup is not a restricted use pesticide, and we know that they use lots of it. They're trying to develop new versions of Roundup and develop the plants that are resistant to that. What's of concern when we talk about 80 chemicals, it's because each one of these is a formulation. And they only list the active ingredient, but there's all these inert ingredients that are even more toxic to human life and animal life and plant life. And so that's where we get the 80 chemicals. There might be 15 listed here, but when you look at the formulations, each one might have 15 to 20 chemicals. So it could be a lot more than 80.
Oh, so as we've said before, the risks from GMO to farmers. And we've been hearing a lot on the TV and the mailers that the farms are being impacted because they would have to go out of business if this moratorium were enacted. In fact,
nothing could be further from the truth.
The reason
we're protecting small farmers.
And pesticide drift, which creates crop damage, is one of the big risks, okay? Genetic contamination from GMO pollen. Well, here's a big issue. 80% of Big Island non-GMO papayas were infected with the GMO DNA, and 20% on Oahu. And so that led to loss of market share. The world demand for GMOs is dropping. Japan and Australia have banned the import of any GMO crops, which was the big market for Big Island papaya. So 50% of Big Island papaya farmers went out of business. It wasn't because of the ring spot virus. It was because of GMO contamination of their farms.
The other risk to farmers, now we're just talking about how does GMO cropping or research put local farmers at risk. That's what this is about. One of the things that we know from history is that Monsanto is very proud of their history of suing small farmers and putting them out of business. In fact, they boast on their website to their investors to suing more than 1,200 small farmers and forcing 700 more into settlements for growing GMO crops that they never intended to grow because those crops were infected by the GMO field just down the way.
Upwind.
Upwind, yes. And what are more risks from GMOs? Well, there's been this huge development of superweeds and superbugs. The way that it happens is because kind of the same way as antibiotic resistance developed from overuse of antibiotics in hospitals, well, overuse of Roundup and other pesticides has led to the rise of superweeds and superbugs worldwide.
Now, just parenthetically here, we're talking pesticides. There's 3 kinds of pesticides. There's herbicides, which are for the weeds and plants. There's insecticides, which are for the insects, and fungicides, which are to target the unwanted fungi. And so pesticides is the general generic term for it, but Roundup is an herbicide. And so it is responsible for superweed development. And Rodale Institute reports that there's 197 superweed species that have developed in the last 15 years on millions of acres throughout the United States.
And what's the industry's solution? It's become an arm race of ever more toxic chemicals. The EPA just approved Roundup and 2,4-D on certain corn and soybeans developed by Dahl, or Mycogen. It just seems like, boy, we're going in the wrong direction. It's the actual system of overusing pesticides that's developing resistance in weeds and bugs. And the other risk to farmers in the area, is disease from chemical exposure. And that's also a risk to the people who work for Monsanto and Mycogen. We're really concerned. In fact, we asked, do they test their workers before they start working, and on a regular basis, do they test their urine for the presence of pesticides? They do not. The disease that can come from chemical exposure, it can affect the farmer, it can affect the gardener, it can affect your family, pets, wildlife, and pollinators, which is a very serious issue. Here's an example. In Molokai, a dust storm. We're looking at genetic contamination, we're looking at pesticide drift.
More risks to people living in a GMO lab. Here we go with more risks. This chemical-laden dust spread to surrounding areas. We just talked about this. But one of the main issues are the playgrounds. Amazing that 2 schools on Molokai are right next door to pesticide applications on GMO fields. Children have come home sick. There's a lot of denial about this. People have not wanted to share the fact that they are experiencing illness from this. There's some sense of shame about that. Unfortunate. Homes and yards. Gets into the groundwater, into the water, and onto the reefs.
And you know, in Hawaii, the culture, there's so much sustainability would come from the reef if it was healthy, if there were fish. In my 44 years of being on Maui, I have watched such a decline in the health of the reef and the variety of fish. It's just staggering how so many of the reefs have died. And it's like, if you're wanting to do sustainable Hawaiian agriculture, it includes fishing and getting opihi. And the thing is with all the runoff from the pesticides, we're definitely damaging our wildlife and we're damaging our reefs. We saw the article in the paper about the turtles, the endangered green sea turtle, getting tumors all over their bodies from these super weeds that have grown in response to the over-application and runoff of fertilizers. Anyway, it's a serious issue. Mom?
Well, the green turtles eat these weeds and then tumors develop. Well, here's another. This year, another risk. The Department of Health tested 38 surface water samples around the state, and all were found to contain pesticides. Every single one. That was the Department of Health.
You'd think that you would have seen that in the paper. You know, it's like, how come that wasn't headline news? Whoa, every single surface water sample contaminated with pesticides?
So glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, was found in recent tests of Kihei tap water, urine, and breast milk. Oh my. This was a private test done by a private lab. Want to talk about that?
The first step in any scientific study is observation. And so there's been lots of observation of potential damage associated with pesticide exposure. And in this situation, it was these tests, these urine and breast milk and water tests, were privately funded, but sent off to independent laboratories on the mainland. But it was an individual here who said, you know what, I want to know what's going on. And so they were willing to put up a few $1,000s to get a number of tests done amongst a number of people. And so it's just, you know, it's like the canary in the coal mine. It's like, hey, here's some observations. We need to look deeper into this.
And the testing that we would see being done would be done by impartial, independent labs, and they would be specific to what is happening and developed by a consortium of scientists and people who are selected because of their impartiality.
Yeah. So just kind of reminding people again in this slide about the trade winds and the water runoff drift affecting the town of Kihei.
So this is South Kihei fields. We were looking at the Ohukai and the Central Maui fields before. These fields are very large. You see the size of Kihei and the size of that South Kihei field, pretty close to the same. The water runoff with the blue arrow, you'll see, is just above Charlie Young Beach. And you'll see the drift from trade winds is right over Kamali'i Elementary School. You see the new Kihei police station.
Yeah, in fact, that water runoff comes right out at the cove, where there's the more people surfing and learning how to surf and supping than anywhere else in Kihei is at the cove. And that's
it's only
where
when it rains in Kihei. You know, it's runoff. Okay. But it does get there.
Next. So what are the chemicals doing to people? Well, we don't really know because we haven't gotten a spray schedule. We don't know what they're spraying when. And that's the only way to be able to really compare. These symptoms happened 3 days after that application. So that's why we want to test to find out. Let's test to find out. Let's get some transparency from these corporations.
Now, I want to point out that these are animal studies that we're looking at, okay, that have linked Roundup to birth defects, death of fetus, lung, kidney, heart, skeletal malformations, endocrine disruption, DNA damage, nervous system disruption, carcinogenic effects, and antibiotic resistance. These are in animals. These are links. These are actual links between these diseases and Roundup.
And also, just to point out, Roundup has also been very clearly linked to breast cancer. And when you look on this list about endocrine disruption, the endocrine system is disrupted by much smaller amounts of chemical exposure than a lot of the other systems. And America has the highest rate of breast cancer and prostate cancer of any other country in the world. And those are endocrine cancers. Those are cancers of the endocrine system.
Now, the studies haven't been done on people yet, and we'll talk about that in a minute. What are these 80 chemicals?
Yeah, and so like I said, the GMO companies, they won't disclose exactly what and how much they spray or in what combinations. And in order to do safety tests, or in order for a doctor to figure out what the symptoms are coming from, they need to know what the chemicals are that their patients are being exposed to.
The EPA told our county council that they don't test or regulate chemical formulations, such as Roundup. Roundup is a formulation. Only the isolated active ingredient or active principle, the AP, which is glyphosate. They do test for glyphosate, and they've determined that there's a tolerance level that people can survive with without any adverse effects. But the adjuvant, the additive, the surfactant, POE-A, in Roundup has been found to be 10,000 times more toxic to human cell lines than its active principle.
And they call that inert. That's an inert ingredient.
Now, just 2 weeks ago, they did change their labeling policy, and they're no longer calling POE inert, polyoxylated ethylamine. They're calling it other ingredients. Okay?
Whoop-de-doo.
We're making a step. Okay.
Whoop-de-doo. These 80 chemicals, they mix in our fields, and they create new, not necessarily new chemicals, but they definitely create new effects on the organisms that are being exposed versus exposed to Roundup, or exposed to Roundup and 2,4-D and all the surfactants in the formula.
And remember that list that they use of restricted chemicals. They're putting these chemical cocktails together. We saw that, a part of that list a moment ago.
And the thing is if you've got 80 chemicals, you can, all these different combinations, that's a trillion combinations. And the EPA doesn't test for any of it. The EPA does not monitor their sites. The EPA doesn't do any testing. The EPA has no idea what's going on in our Maui fields.
Nor does the Department of Health, nor does the Department of Agriculture.
And the thing is, there's no regulation on GMOs in the state of Hawaii. At the state level, there's absolutely no regs on the book. Yeah, there's regs on pesticides on the books at the state level, and that's why the federal judge in the Kauai case dismissed their case because they're like, oh no, it's regulated at the state level. Well, it's not being regulated. Yeah, there might be rules on the books, but there's no enforcement, and they're not actually going out and making sure that people aren't being hurt by these chemicals. They're protecting big ag industries' interests instead.
Non-target wildlife being affected by GMO pesticides. And we know that the pesticides' targets are the pests. They're either the insects or the weeds. However, people should be on this list too. Right. When we're wild. There's non-targeted wildlife, bees, their longevity and behavior. These universities, Harvard University, ladybird beetles, and from Scotland, lacewing larvae, monarch butterflies, oh dear, beneficial soil microbes, birds, and frogs.
So yeah, these were all studies from universities showing the damage to these various wildlife from GMO pesticides, or pesticides directly associated with GMO crops. And even the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has banned GMOs from all national wildlife areas. That's 150 million acres. Yay! Go, go, go. But we're concerned, is GMO development here threatening the web of life on Maui?
And here's an example of just that very thing. Monsanto contamination drift from that Central Valley fields, and you'll see the water runoff is going right through the Kealia Pond National Wildlife Refuge.
So I think it's time we call the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and say, are you aware that there's GMO fields about a half a mile upwind from your wildlife refuge? Like we said, that there was no human pesticide toxicity studies really done yet.
And the reason is because we're not the target organism for these pesticides. And
it's unethical to expose humans to pesticides and poisons. You're not allowed to do that. And yet people are exposed all the time to these pesticides. You know, farm workers out in the field, people downwind, kids in schools. And there's numerous correlations between pesticide exposure and diseases. Like what kind, Mom?
And here's some of these diseases: cancer, autism, Alzheimer's, diabetes. And, you know, correlations and causation, we have to get a clear understanding of what the difference is here. Correlations are when there's an increase in, say, pesticide use and the rise in autism in our children. Those are correlations. But did one cause the other? There's no proof yet because, number one, we don't know, GMOs aren't labeled, so we don't know who's getting what and in what concentration. That's why they don't want to have them labeled. Number two, the causation factor is an issue. The rise in people riding bicycles to work correlates with the rise in pesticide use. It correlates with the rise in diabetes. There doesn't seem to be a real relationship between that, though. You know, you wouldn't, as a scientist, you wouldn't go, oh, I'm going to investigate that. There's also a rise in the popularity and use of organic foods during that same period. Would you think that organic food would cause cancer? Probably not. You wouldn't pursue that. But at last February, there was a group of studies published on pesticide toxicity on human cell lines. Now, these are live cell lines in Petri plates, and they did 9 different pesticides. That was insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides. Embryonic cell lines, that means unborn babies, placental cell lines, and hepatic liver cell lines. And the National Institutes of Health published the study and found up to 1,000 times the toxicity in the formulas used in common pesticides compared to just the active ingredient, 1,000 times. Not only were the adjuvants, that's the additives, often found to be more toxic than the active ingredient, but they also increase the toxicity of the active ingredient. These are things that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, never tests for.
Yeah. We mentioned Bt a little bit earlier, and Bt being Bacillus thuringiensis, and that's a toxin that is
a soil bacterium.
A soil bacterium that creates a toxin that pokes holes in the lining of insect stomachs. Well, it pokes holes in that type of tissue, and a lot of organisms have their gut lined with similar tissue. As Bt relates to human health, the EPA and their Scientific Advisory Council, based on mouse and farm worker studies, they say that...
It was back in 2001. That's important to put it in time.
It's like we've known about this for a long time.
But this is at the beginning of the use of genetically modified or of genetic engineering. The very beginning, before the EPA was somehow instructed to ignore this.
The studies suggest that Bt proteins could act as antigenic and allergenic sources, and only surveillance and clinical assessment of exposed individuals would confirm the allergenicity of Bt products. The thing is that you can't do the studies because they're not labeled, and so you don't know who ate the Bt corn. And the other reason why these studies weren't pursued is because of the revolving door, which brought a Monsanto executive into a position of influence at the EPA.
Which is a process that happens all the time now in government. You'll have industry people lobbying for industry and then being invited to serve on a governmental board.
Yeah.
And then go back again.
Yeah.
Revolving door.
We've definitely seen that between FDA and Monsanto numerous times, especially Michael Taylor. He was an attorney for Monsanto, and then he went to the FDA, and they created a new position for him called the head of public policy. And in that position, he was able to hush the science research that was coming out of the FDA that was showing the dangers of GMO food in animal tests. And as head of public policy, he was able to keep the lid on that and just kind of shuffle those scientists off to other projects that were inconsequential and keep that out of the public's awareness. And then he went back to Monsanto, and he was there for a few years, and then he came back to the FDA, and he was there for a few years, and back to Monsanto, and back to 3 times he's worked for the FDA and worked for Monsanto. Now that is a revolving door.
Well, that's conflict of interest.
Yeah. Moving on to, we were talking about Bt exposure to humans. Now we're talking Bt on the farm. In GMO fields, Bt toxin persists up to 3 years, accumulating and killing insects. And the irony is that as the corn plant that's just saturated with the Bt toxin, because every single cell has produced thousands and thousands of copies of the Bt toxin, that plant is trying to break down in the soil. Well, there's bugs that would come and help break it down and digest the plant matter, but they get killed from the insecticide inside the body of the plant. So what happens is the concentration of Bt toxin, it builds up and it accumulates. It's that, like I said, in GMO crops, it's thousands of times higher than if it were sprayed on the surface, say in organic farming. If you've got a problem with white butterflies, cabbage moths eating your broccoli or your kale, you might spray some Bt. It comes in a powder, you mix it up with water, you spray it. It lasts for a couple days on the plant. It's broken down by UV light, and it's broken down by the weather, and you can wash it off. So when you get that kale or that broccoli, you can wash the Bt off.
It's not impregnated into every cell of the plant, whereas with the genetically engineered kale or broccoli, which just hasn't happened yet, but corn, it's in every single cell.
They made this statement that the Bt GMOs, that they were going to reduce pesticide use. But like we saw earlier with the antibiotic overuse, creating resistance, that same thing has happened with Bt. So this insecticide in the plant, it has created resistance. So all these pests that were affected by it, a lot of them have developed resistance to the Bt toxin. And so what that did is, in like reaction to it, and as a result of the overuse of Bt corn and Bt soybeans, is that they had to come up with a new insecticide. And these are the neonicotinoid insecticides. Now they're more specific, and so
nicotine-based. This is another use for the tobacco.
So what we've seen is that these neonicotinoid insecticides have causing widespread collapse of bee colonies. And there's a lot of research out of a lot of universities. At Harvard's the most recent, that's showing how bee colonies are collapsing because of the overuse of neonics as a result of resistance developing from GMOs.
And the neonicotinoids are popular because they do not affect mammals as much. This is one of the rationalizations for their use and why they become so popular so fast worldwide.
Examples would be imidacloprid and chlorpyrifos. Those are both neonics or neonicotinoid insecticides. Like she said, they're not as toxic to mammals, however they still are, but they're highly toxic to insects. And the way they act is they bind to the neural receptor, to the nerves of the insect, and interfere with its function.
And they won't come off.
And they don't come off. There's no antidote. Previous insecticides that were on the market, they were more broad spectrum, and so people were more damaged. However, there was an antidote to it. And so if you got exposed to an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor, you could take an antidote and recover. If a farmer or a kid is exposed to neonicotinoid insecticides, which are being sprayed here in Maui fields, that lands on their neurons and they can't come off. They just don't ever come off. What that does is that reduces IQ, and it leads to seizures and motor problems and being slower and having the shakes. Those neonics have caused this huge loss of pollinators.
And maybe people don't really understand the function of pollinators in human life, you know? We couldn't live without the pollinators. The bees are responsible for the almonds in California. And a couple of years ago, the almond crop was almost collapsed because of the collapse of the bee colonies because of neonicotinoid applications. So we experienced a
very rapid increase in the price of almonds. That was one of them that I noticed personally.
Yeah. And of course, honey has gone much higher. Here's some statistics for us if we haven't had enough. In 2007, 400 million acres treated with neonicotinoids. Just 3 years later, 1/4 of the world has been treated with neonics.
That's serious exposure
worldwide. Remember that list, ladybugs and monarch butterflies and birds? Megan was sharing with me on the way down to the studio here about the fact that birds are the #1 insecticide in the world and always have served because that's their food supply. Yeah. But we're killing the birds with our pesticide.
The way the birds are being damaged from the neonics is that neonicotinoids are a systemic herbicide. But you apply it, it's not a GMO herbicide or insecticide. You either coat the seed, and then as the plant grows, it'll be through every cell of the plant, it will have a neonicotinoid, the presence of it, in the pollen, in the roots, in the leaves, and
the birds eat the seeds.
And if the birds eat the seeds, say, you're pouring hundreds and hundreds of pounds of your neonic-coated corn seed into the hopper so you can drive your combine down the field and plant your neonic-treated Bt corn seed, the birds are going to come and pick up the few grains that you dropped and that you spilled. All it takes is one neonic-treated grain of corn to kill a bird. And like I said, birds are nature's insecticide. They're the ones that come to people's rescue when there's an infestation of insects. And they're being wiped out, and so by these neonics.
So this is why we ask, is the web of life being destroyed on Maui? Well, can we trust the GMO companies to do the testing? Let's see. Let's look at the industry's history. Remember Bisphenol A used in plastic infant milk bottles and other food containers? Well, no industry-funded study, and there were 11 published in July of 2005, ever found adverse consequences linked to BPA exposure. However, 92% of government-funded studies reported significant effects from low doses of BPA in experimental animals. Well, the FDA did ban BPA. We need independent studies. That's all there is to it. We can't trust the government or the industry.
Yeah. The studies that Monsanto provided to the FDA to vouch for the safety of genetically modified food in a big lawsuit against the FDA that forced them to release 30,000 pages of confidential documents showed that Monsanto had actually intentionally botched the studies showing safety of GM foods, and that they switched control groups and they did all this stuff to make it look like it was safe when it actually wasn't. And that's what came on to the American food market in 1996. And you saw that enormous increase in seed sales. Well, that's also that same ramping increase of food, GM food, on the American market, or on the world market, actually. This issue here, this moratorium, isn't about genetically modified food. It's not about labeling, but we're just pointing out how we haven't been able to get the information that's needed in order to do the testing, in order to track exposures. We need independent studies. Now, when it comes to Monsanto and Dow and these kind of big chemi-ag companies, what is their history like? Well, can we trust Monsanto? They said it was safe to produce PCBs in Anniston, Alabama, but a Washington Post article revealed that Monsanto hid decades of pollution.
And here's this fish that died in 3.5 seconds when placed in the pond. Well, Anniston, Alabama, they ended up spewing their pollution into the creeks and ponds of the city.
And it traveled again in the air and contaminated the soil. So Monsanto, they weren't ever able to control their discharges and throughout their whole 37-year history of PCB production in Anniston. And so in 2003, they finally confessed. Monsanto confessed, well, they were forced to. All these confidential documents were released that showed that if they were to lose $1 by notifying the community that they might want to take precautions because, oops, we spilled some in the creek, nope, they were going to lose $1. So they didn't tell the people of Anniston. And when the judge brought down the sentence, it was crimes against humanity, the most indecent example of despicable. So anyway, they were forced to pay $700 million to more than 20,000 residents after inducing cancer in many of them. And by that time, a huge percentage of the population had already died from cancer.
Once again, can we trust Monsanto? In Nitro, West Virginia, Monsanto operated a chemical plant from 1929 to 1995 and made the herbicide, you've all heard of it, Agent Orange. And it has dioxin as a byproduct. And you see here illustrated the U.S. veterans of Vietnam are still dying from Agent Orange, as well as Vietnamese children still being born with birth defects. Well, in 2012, Monsanto settled with the people of Nitro for $93 million for having polluted and sickened them.
Monsanto says that open air and chemical GMO experiments on Maui are safe. I'm going to say that again. Monsanto says open air chemical and GMO experiments on Maui are safe. Can we ignore what they did in Anniston and Nitro? Well, let's look at Superfund sites. Do you know what a Superfund site is? A Superfund site is one of the most contaminated places on Earth, and the EPA is responsible for cleanup. And that's paid for by our tax dollars and penalties to industry. Now, Monsanto currently owns 9 active Superfund sites in 7 cities and is responsible in part to a total of 93 Superfund sites. Dow Chemical, Mycogen, the ones working on Molokai, They're connected to 96 Superfund sites. We really do have reason to be concerned because of their history and of hiding information from the communities in which they operate. And so we're concerned. Is Maui Nui next? Are we another Monsanto Superfund site? We want to prevent that from happening.
So the precautionary principle, better safe than sorry, is being invoked, because it is a worldwide issue. The U.S. Supreme Court established this principle in 1986 and said the state is not required to sit idly by and wait until potentially irreversible environmental damage has occurred, or until the scientific community agrees on what environmental risks are or are not dangerous before it acts to avoid such consequences. Saying we can, if we have the information, move before the worst happens.
Or even if we don't have the information, if there's suspicion,
yes,
if there's been some observation of potential harm, it's okay.
Correlations, anecdotes.
The state, the county can take action to prevent that environmental damage from happening, just to be precautionary. It's okay. So,
what's on the ballot?
What's on the ballot?
The voter initiative proposes GMO development on Maui is suspended until health and environmental studies have been performed to verify safety.
And our people and our land should not be used as guinea pigs for GMO research and chemical experimentation.
And the text of the ballot initiative, very convoluted and difficult to understand. However, it does say what is in the bill.
But it doesn't say moratorium. That's the one word that got left out in the initiative on the bill. It says Maui Voter Initiative, Genetically Engineered Organisms.
Vote yes to test.
If you think that being better safe than sorry, vote yes to test. We know that it's not going to put all these people out of business and this stuff they're saying on TV.
We're so close to done here, but who is affected by the bill? And this is something that you've been hearing a lot about lately. And according to county records, only 1% of Maui farmers grow GMO crops. Legal contract with the seed manufacturer is required to purchase and grow GMO seeds.
So those currently growing GMO crops may finish their cropping cycle, and then they replant with non-GMO seeds. So to avoid fines, just don't replant with GMO seeds. You know, it's like fasten your seatbelt if you don't want to get a ticket. There's been so much on the news and in your mailbox about the average Joe, the backyard gardener farmer, being fined, being arrested.
And it hasn't been on the news. There have been TV spots that have been put right after the news that looks like it's a news reporting, but it's actually a commercial.
And so just to refer to the law here, in Section 5, it is unlawful for any person or entity to knowingly propagate, cultivate, raise, grow, or test genetically engineered organisms within the county of Maui for that time that the moratorium is in effect. Well, who does this not apply to? This doesn't apply to the propagation, cultivation, raising, growing, or testing of GE organisms that are in mid-growth cycle when this chapter is enacted. So if you've got GMO corn, papaya in the ground right now, you get to leave it until it lives its whole lifespan. And then when it's time to replant, just don't replant GMOs. It's healthier to do that anyway. It's better to rotate varieties. The bill will not affect backyard gardeners. There are no papaya police. You can't just go out to the store and buy GMO seeds. They're not available at Home Depot or Ace Hardware. Like Mom said, you have to have a contract with a GMO seed company in order to get the seed. And in that agreement to purchase GMO seed, you also agree to buy pesticide. And you agree not to replant that seed in your next season. And listen to this, you also have to sign a waiver of liability where you agree to hold harmless the seed supplier if people get sick from your product. Wow, they covered every base. And so about the jobs, they want us to think that the economy and that people are just going to fall off a cliff and that everything's going to grind to a halt. There's 600 employees of the GMO companies. They're not going to lose their jobs. No one will fall off a cliff, and the economy won't grind to a halt. Remember when Aloha Airlines closed? That was 3,000 people, 3,000 employees. We barely noticed a ripple across the state. Paia Mill, Maui Land and Pine, I think we'll keep going just fine. We're comparing a temporary job loss to permanent health damage. You think about it.
Monsanto and Dahl have already spent probably close to $4 million at this point in false advertising, hiding behind the so-called citizens group against a make-believe farming ban, inciting fear of job loss and economic ruin.
And the thing is like when we called and talked to Monsanto and asked, are you going to be firing all your employees? And they said, no, there might be a few jobs lost. The thing is that non-GMO hybrid corn seed is in great demand since international purchases of GMO corn have plummeted 85% this year. Monsanto has already begun growing non-GMO seed right here. So
all these Midwestern farmers are suing Monsanto for $1 billion to help with their loss of almost $450 million in corn that has been sent back because they wouldn't accept it. So the economy is going to do just fine.
Yeah, a safe, healthy environment is critical to Maui's tourism industry, our largest source of revenue. A lot more than 600 jobs would be lost if visitors stayed away to avoid chemical exposure in a contaminated island. And we know that investing in safe, healthy food production will give us a much larger and more stable economy while enhancing food security and reducing our dependency on imports. Well, thank you for joining me, Diana.
Well, thank you for having us. That was valuable for all of us, and we certainly appreciate your time and interest in watching this show.
Yeah, we hope that you've been able to fill some holes in your understanding about farming and genetics and what we're actually at risk here on Maui if we don't do a temporary moratorium and find out what's really going on with an environmental impact statement, a study, and a public health study. So thank you for joining us on the Maui Malama Aina show. Ahui ho.
Yes to test.
Vote yes to test.